On 18th of July 1943, 20 minutes after sunrise, the Pacific War delivered one of its harshest truths to a single B-24 crew. Bombers did not beat Zero fighters, not in speed, not in climb, not in survival rates. USAAF records from the first half of 1943 showed that a lone Liberator caught outside formation almost never returned. Crews wrote it in letters, commanders buried the proof. But that morning, a Liberator from the 324th Bomb Squadron lifted off from a rough coral strip on the northern Solomons with a mission that looked simple on a map: strike a Japanese airfield, then come home. What the map didn't show were the Zero squadrons at Belial Island already refueling, the radar station at Shortland transmitting intercept vectors, or the reality that the bomber's own fuel lines could ignite from a single 20mm hit. By the time the radio man tuned in a distant warning, multiple bogies airborne, the bomber was already deep in enemy airspace, alone, exposed, and moments from meeting a kill ratio that seemed carved into the war itself. The men aboard had all seen the aftermath of what that meant. They had watched burned-out wrecks pushed to the side of jungle airstrips, their tails still bearing squadron codes that once represented living friends. They had heard the stories of B-24s that broke apart in dives, of fire that spread too fast for anyone to escape, of gunners found still at their posts in melted turrets. Over time, the pattern had turned into a belief that this machine might carry them to altitude, but would not bring them back if anything serious went wrong. Still, orders were orders. The mission was judged necessary. Japanese airfields in the Solomons supported operations against Allied convoys and troops. Leaving them unmolested meant more ships sunk, more men killed on the ground. So the bomber flew on. Just one aircraft in a wider offensive, its crew following checklists and habits that kept fear at a manageable level. Then the radio man received a report from the early warning net and passed it forward in the calm, clipped language training demanded. Enemy aircraft were inbound, closing from ahead. Somewhere beyond the bomber's nose, Zero fighters were climbing to intercept. In that moment, the mission's mathematics changed. It was no longer about fuel calculations and bomb loads. It was about whether a disliked, distrusted aircraft could survive contact with opponents its own crews privately believed had every advantage. The consolidated B-24 Liberator existed because before the war, staff officers had written a requirement on paper. They wanted a bomber that could fly farther than the B-17 Flying Fortress, carry a heavier load, and do it at speeds that made interception difficult. Engineers answered with an aircraft built around a high aspect ratio Davis wing that promised exceptional range and efficiency. They added a deep fuselage for fuel and bombs, turbocharged Pratt & Whitney engines for altitude, and multiple .50 caliber Browning machine guns for defense. On specification sheets, the result looked ideal for a vast theater like the Pacific. On isolated airstrips in New Guinea and the Solomons, the view was different. The thin wing that delivered range also demanded higher takeoff and landing speeds, punishing pilots on short, rough runways cut from jungle or coral. The complex fuel system, routed through narrow spaces, proved vulnerable to combat damage and maintenance errors. Early production issues, rushed deliveries, and the brutal environment combined to produce accidents that never appeared in recruitment posters. Crews watched aircraft ground loop, overrun, or fail to lift, then burn in bright, short-lived fires. Experience began to reshape reputation. The same long legs that allowed deep strikes also meant long hours over water, often without reliable fighter escort. Mechanical failures that would have been inconvenient over Europe became life-threatening when the only landing option was the ocean. Structural limits, misunderstood or ignored in the rush of combat, led to stories of B-24s shedding parts in steep turns or dives. Each incident added a detail to the informal verdict forming in ready rooms and mess halls. Crews did not condemn the Liberator in official debriefings. They did it in private letters home, in jokes traded during card games, in the way they looked at the aircraft when its engines were silent. The nickname Flying Coffin emerged naturally, a dark shorthand for an impression they could not fully prove but could not shake. At the same time, they respected its strengths. The bomber's .50 caliber guns could throw devastating fire. Properly handled, a formation of B-24s presented a lethal box of overlapping arcs. Commanders tried to lean into that strength. They ordered tight formations, drilled gunners relentlessly, and emphasized the protective power of mutual support. In massed raids, the doctrine sometimes worked. Zeros diving into disciplined defensive fire paid a price. But conditions in the Southwest Pacific rarely matched doctrinal diagrams. Clouds broke up formations. Fuel concerns forced staggered returns. Escorts, often flying P-38 Lightnings or P-40 Warhawks at the edge of their own ranges, sometimes had to turn back early. That was how single aircraft ended up alone over hostile water, out of position and out of support. Bomber crews knew it. When this particular B-24's escort fighters disappeared into higher cloud to pursue their own intercept vectors, the men aboard recognized the old familiar pattern. They were a large, obvious target with a troubled reputation, moving on a predictable route toward a known enemy airfield. To those who believed the Flying Coffin nickname had been earned, it felt less like the start of a mission and more like a test they had not chosen. By 0930 hours, the bomber had settled into what crews called the long quiet, a stretch of predictable, engine noise and routine checks that often preceded either a clean run or a sudden fight. Heat rising from the ocean warped the air around the aircraft, turning every glazed surface into a shifting mirror. The crew had been scanning for enemy movement since crossing a notional line drawn on the navigator's map, an invisible boundary where Japanese fighters were statistically most likely to appear. The first warning did not come from the horizon. It came from the tail. The gunner's voice, normally relaxed during these long transits, snapped into a single, clipped report. A Zero had appeared high and astern, followed quickly by two more. This was the tactic many Japanese pilots preferred. Approach from the sun's direction, exploit its glare, and dive into the bomber's rear quarter where gunners had to react fastest. Charts, manuals and lectures had described such encounters. What they rarely conveyed was the speed at which theory dissolved into reflex. Within seconds, the crew understood that their formation, already stretched thin by weather, was no longer a formation at all. The other Liberators were now specks or ghosts inside distant cloud banks, too far to provide overlapping fire. The escort fighters tasked with reaching their own intercept points were invisible. The bomber was alone, its silhouette framed against an ocean that offered no concealment. Inside the waist compartment, gunners yanked back charging handles and steadied themselves against the vibration of the airframe. The navigator, pen skidding across his chart with each jolt, recalculated their position, with the knowledge that fuel margins depended on accuracy. Each man could feel the shift in the aircraft's motion. Small corrections made by a pilot who knew the bomber's survival depended on inches, not grand maneuvers. As the first Zero entered its dive, its white wings flashing briefly through a break in the haze, the question that hung unspoken over so many missions resurfaced. Would this be another brief entry in the squadron diary? Missing, failed to return? Or would it stand as one of the rare engagements where a bomber, designed for endurance rather than agility, met fighters head-on and lived to report it? The moment struck with speed. Tracers reached out from the tailgun. Cannon fire from the Zero cracked past the fuselage. The airframe trembled as the pilot began to maneuver in a way that contradicted every lecture they had been taught. Instead of fleeing, he angled the bomber into a position meant to disrupt the attacker's timing. It was a risky choice, but indecision would have been worse. As the dive steepened and the Zero closed, the crew braced themselves for the first pass, knowing that whatever happened in the next 30 seconds would determine not only this fight, but the credibility of every whispered belief about their aircraft's limits. The fight had begun, and the sky around them was no longer empty. It was, narrowing, tightening, becoming a battleground shaped by angles, speed and resolve. And 3 Zeros were diving, confident that the bomber beneath them would do what so many others had, break apart, burn, and sink into the vastness below. If you're enjoying this story, hit like, share it with someone who also loves hidden chapters of history, and subscribe for more hidden stories of World War II. And after you finish the documentary, share your thoughts in the comments below. I'd love to hear your take. The Zero struck first in the way its designers intended. Fast, precise, and committed. Approaching from high astern, it dived through the turbulent air behind the bomber, its 20mm cannons already firing short, disciplined bursts. The impact was immediate. Shards of plexiglass cascaded across the tail gunner's compartment. Metal rang with hollow, violent notes as fragments punched through the skin. For an instant, the entire aircraft seemed to absorb the blow without answering it. Then the bomber moved, not downward, not away, but toward the attacker. The pilot rolled the aircraft into the Zero's path, compressing the window in which the Japanese pilot could aim. This was not a maneuver taught in standard doctrine. Allied tactics emphasized mutual protection within formation, not isolated aggression. Yet alone over the sea, defensive diagrams meant little. The crew had already learned the first principle of their survival. Predictability favored the fighter. Unpredictability favored the desperate. As the bomber banked, the top turret rotated smoothly into alignment. The gunner inside had seconds, maybe less, to track the Zero as it overshot, surprised by the sudden change in geometry. He squeezed the triggers. The vibration of twin 50 caliber guns rippled through the fuselage, each round a metallic argument against the aircraft's reputation for helplessness. A brief flash appeared along the Zero's engine cowling. Smoke followed. The fighter rolled, inverted, and dropped out of sight. One kill. It happened fast, almost too fast to register, but the significance was clear. A flying Coffin had just brought down an opponent revered for agility and lethality. There was no pause. More fighters were converging, black specks swelling into defined shapes against the horizon. The sky, once broad and open, had become a puzzle of angles, where the bomber could position itself, where the gunners could concentrate fire, where each Zero would attempt to exploit blind spots. The crew worked as if tied together by instinct rather than intercom chatter. The pilot sought angles that forced attackers into difficult shots. The gunners stitched the air with controlled bursts, not wasteful streams. The engineer monitored temperatures and pressures that could spell the difference between flight and plunge. Every movement had purpose: when to dive, when to climb, when to accept hits to preserve altitude, all decisions made in seconds. The bomber was no longer simply an airframe. It was an assembly of men, steel, fatigue, and will, held together by training that had been tested repeatedly and had not yet failed. Still, one truth remained unchanged. Killing one Zero had only thinned the attack, not broken it. More fighters were approaching, experienced pilots who had seen bomber crews panic under similar pressure. They would not be deterred by a single loss, and the crew knew the next passes would test them harder. There was no illusion of safety. There was only the knowledge that the first kill had bought time, and that time was the currency they needed most as the sky darkened with the shapes of more incoming fighters. The third Zero attacked from a direction bomber crews feared more than any other, low, fast and hidden, briefly beneath the bomber's own horizon line. It was the angle where defensive coverage thinned, where windows distorted depth, and where reaction time shrank to the width of a heartbeat. Every man aboard understood instantly what that approach meant. They had seen other Liberators torn open by identical attacks, had helped recover remains from aircraft struck in precisely this quadrant. The Coffin nickname was not born from imagination. It came from memories of impacts that began just like this one. The pilot had only seconds to choose. He could hold course and allow the Zero a stable shot. He could dive and risk losing altitude they might need later. Or he could attempt something counterintuitive, change the bomber's position just enough to disrupt the fighter's firing run. Training emphasized consistency, not improvisation. Yet survival often emerged from choices manuals never predicted. He chose the shallow skid, an awkward sliding movement that shifted the bomber sideways as well as downward. It was not elegant, but it forced the approaching Zero to adjust a carefully calculated vector in the last seconds of its run. Inside the waist compartment, the gunner on the threatened side had been scanning empty sky only moments before. Now the Zero slashed into view, almost too quickly to track. Instinct and training fused into action. He opened fire, the 50 caliber stream vibrating through his harness, tracers cutting a bright corridor toward the fighter's nose. At the same instant, the top turret lowered its barrels, adding a second intersecting stream of fire. Together they formed something crude but effective, a crossing arc that punished any pilot who lingered too long on the attack. And the Japanese pilot, battle-tested, confident, facing a bomber that should have been simple prey, lingered a fraction too long. No explosion blossomed, No dramatic fireball spiraled away. Instead, the Zero shuddered mid-bank, its movement losing symmetry. Something critical had been struck. Fuel? Hydraulics? Controls? Or perhaps the pilot himself? The fighter rolled unevenly, then snapped downward in a steep, uncontrolled path. A narrow ribbon of flame trailed from its underside before the sea erased both fighter and fire. 2 kills now confirmed, and another Zero already circling to exploit the bomber's wounded condition. Inside the aircraft, no one celebrated. The intercom carried only functional updates. Smoke. Near the wing route. A possible fuel leak. Ammunition counts dropping. And the steady complaint of an engine that no longer responded cleanly. Each report tightened the invisible clock hanging over them. A bomber could trade altitude for speed, could trade position for survival, but it could not trade structural damage for anything other than risk. The aircraft had become a contradiction, dangerous to its enemies, vulnerable to the smallest miscalculation, still flying, still fighting, yet every maneuver demanded more strain, more trust in a machine that had already absorbed punishment beyond acceptable limits. The crew understood something fundamental. In the sky above the Solomon Sea, luck and judgment rarely lasted forever. Another Zero was moving in, and the next seconds would decide whether their improbable survival streak would continue, or finally break under the pressure of physics and fate. By the time the 4th Zero committed to its attack, the bomber was flying in a condition that would have grounded it instantly under any other circumstance. One engine was feathered, its propeller rigid against the slipstream. Oil streaked the nacelle and darkened the wing route. Control cables had been hit during previous passes, and the pilot felt each input as a hesitant, delayed response. Fragments of plexiglass littered the cockpit floor, remnants of cannon strikes that had come perilously close to ending the fight early. The smell of burning insulation mixed with warm cordite, and the crew breathed it with the resigned awareness that the aircraft around them was failing by degrees. Yet the fundamentals of the battle endured. The Zero, agile and deadly, still needed to approach from a predictable geometry to make its guns effective, and the bomber, though damaged, still carried overlapping arcs of 50 caliber fire capable of turning a precise attack into a fatal mistake. What had changed was the crew's understanding of the stakes. They no longer clung to routines learned in training. They fought from lived experience acquired minute by minute. Knowledge paid for in metal, noise, and risk. The 4th Zero attempted a new angle, a high front-quarter approach designed to avoid the brutal tail and turret fire that had destroyed its predecessors. For a moment, the attacker held the advantage. It had position, speed, and the element of surprise. Under standard doctrine, the bomber's best defense would have been to maintain course and rely on coordinated gunnery. But doctrine had not saved the liberators that now rested at the bottom of the sea. The pilot made a decision that defied every analytical diagram of bomber tactics. He pulled back on the yoke, climbing into the fighter's path. The move drained speed, exposing the bomber's underside, a target no crew wanted to present. From the Zero's cockpit, the view must have seemed decisive. A lumbering, wounded machine rising directly into its guns. The Japanese pilot committed fully, expecting an easy finish. But the climb served a different purpose. It aligned the nose gun and the top turret simultaneously onto the same point in space. When the Zero closed, both positions opened fire at once. Converging streams of a 50 caliber bullets met the fighter head-on. There was no ambiguity this time. Flames erupted across the Zero's engine cowling. The canopy flashed with violent light. The fighter twisted into a cartwheeling descent, shedding fragments as gravity claimed what the guns had begun. 4 Zeros, 1 bomber, a ratio that defied expectation, training, and the grim arithmetic of the Pacific Air War. Inside the aircraft, victory felt nothing like triumph. It felt like fatigue layered over caution, like calculations whispered across the intercom, fuel remaining, structural integrity, distance to base. The crew stared through cracked windows at an ocean that could still swallow them whole if their damaged engines faltered. Survival had been bought with skill, luck, and the willingness to challenge assumptions. Now came the harder question, whether the same battered aircraft that had defied fighters could endure the far quieter, far longer journey back across the empty sea. When the last Zero finally broke away, Either destroyed, damaged, or discouraged, the sky did not feel liberated. It felt emptied, hollow in a way that made every sound inside the bomber sharper. With combat adrenaline fading, the crew began to hear things they had missed in the noise of the fight. The uneven thrum of 3 engines carrying the load of 4, the faint whistle of air slipping through new holes punched in the fuselage, and the low groan of stressed metal adjusting to each shift in wind. The battle had disappeared behind them, but its consequences were now everywhere inside the aircraft. The navigator resumed his work with a seriousness bordering on reverence. Their fuel consumption had changed dramatically during the twisting fight, and the original plan, already optimistic, was obsolete. He recalculated ground speed, wind drift, and remaining distance with the knowledge that error would not mean delay. It would mean ditching. The ocean below, featureless and wide, offered no margin for mistakes. Meanwhile, the pilot eased the bomber toward lower altitude. In denser air, lift increased, drag settled, and fuel burn softened slightly. But dropping too low carried its own risks. Japanese patrol boats operated throughout these waters. Outlying Japanese float planes sometimes skimmed the horizon at the unexpected hours. The Liberator had survived fighters only to find itself vulnerable now to quieter, more patient threats. Damage reports echoed across the intercom. One gunner had taken shrapnel through his sleeve and was pressing a torn cloth against a bleeding arm while refusing to leave his position. Another reported a jammed control surface that rendered some maneuvers sluggish. The engineer listed temperatures and pressures on the wounded engine, each reading worse than the last. The crew listened, balancing grim facts against a fragile hope that the aircraft, this aircraft, might still hold together. Hours stretched, measured by sun, instruments, and nerves. The radio man sent brief coded position updates when allowed, hoping direction-finding stations would create a faint path back towards safety. The aircraft sagged in altitude at a rate impossible to ignore. They lightened the load where they could. Spent casings rattled around their feet. Smoke from earlier hits drifted in thin grey lines toward open windows, carried away by the slipstream. Then someone spotted it. A faint dark thread on the horizon. At first too thin to name, then too solid to deny. Land. Soon after, the faint suggestion of a coral airstrip sharpened into view. Low, pale, and barely longer than the distance they needed to touch down. The crew let out a series of strained laughs, disbelief mixing with exhaustion. A few men exhaled for what felt like the first time in an hour. The landing, when it came, was less a controlled descent and more a survival act. The bomber struck the strip hard. Tires screamed. The airframe flexed in a shuddering bow. The pilot held it steady as long as physics allowed before the aircraft lurched, skidded, and finally rolled to a stop in a cloud of dust and heated air. Ground crews approached cautiously, unsure how a machine this battered had stayed airborne. They counted holes, traced burn marks, and stared at gun barrels worn smooth from use. No one needed a written report to understand what had happened. The flying Coffin had returned, carrying a story that would be told long before paperwork could ever catch up. In the operations hut that evening, the chaos of combat transformed into the discipline of analysis. Intelligence officers arranged gun camera film, damage sketches, and accounts from each gunner. The crew spoke with the steady detachment common among men who had not yet understood the scale of what they had accomplished. Procedures required caution, claims had to be cross-checked against timing, ammunition records, and visual corroboration. No one wanted exaggeration to mar a report as extraordinary as this one, yet the evidence aligned. 4 Mitsubishi A6M Zeros destroyed, a 5th driven off smoking. A damaged bomber, isolated and outnumbered, had met Japan's premier fighter on unequal terms and emerged not only intact, but victorious. In an era defined by grim arithmetic, this single mission defied every expectation. The story moved across the airstrip faster than mechanics could patch the holes in the bomber's skin. Men who had once muttered about the Liberator's shortcomings now stood beside the battered aircraft with a kind of quiet disbelief. This was the same model they had watched burn on runways, the same airframe that maintenance crews cursed during inspections, the same shape that had inspired the cruel, persistent nickname, Flying Coffin. Yet here it sat, scarred, scorched, but standing, having humiliated opponents whose speed, agility, and reputation had dominated the early Pacific War. Commanders noted the implications. The fight did not suggest the B-24 had suddenly become a superior air-to-air platform. It revealed something deeper, more human. How discipline, cooperation, and tactical judgment could transform an aircraft's limitations into fleeting moments of advantage. Each gunner had contributed, each decision had mattered, and each risk had been calculated under immense pressure. Across the theatre, the larger war ground onward. Bombers would continue to fall to flak, weather, mechanical failure, and fighters. Zeros, too, would continue to die as Allied tactics improved, and new aircraft, P-38s, Hellcats, Corsairs, began to dominate. But the statistical trends that shaped official reports never captured the full truth of individual missions. Some flights, rare, improbable, unforgettable, showed what could happen when men refused to accept the role assigned to them by reputation or fear. Years later, museum visitors would wander past restored Liberators, tracing the rivets and reading plaques that listed campaign names, units, and losses. They would see photographs of crews barely older than teenagers, leaning against machines that represented both danger and duty. Veterans, when asked about the aircraft's flaws, sometimes acknowledged them with a half smile. But when asked about missions like the one flown over the Solomon Sea, their answer tended to shift. Because on that single day, one bomber broke the pattern. One crew disproved the expectations of pilots on both sides. One so-called flying coffin carried its men into a battle they should not have survived, and returned carrying proof that the war's harshest reputations were not always final. And long after the metal was scrapped or displayed, the memory remained. Not of a perfect machine, but of a battered one that refused to yield when everything told it to fall.